there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Makeshift Stories presents a monthly journey into the improbable.
This month's story, Somewhere and Sometime. Episode 174, The Front, Part 2. Read by Rylan Nilsson. A vortex of anxiety swept me into an all-too-familiar place as Crystal wheeled our modified 36-foot Roadmaster onto the expressway, then north on Highway 3 at the western edge of town. The GPS on the dashboard estimated it would take 8 hours to meet up with Interstate 1 North, built to ensure our country's sovereignty over the new unincorporated territories. But could you trust a navigational system that hadn't been updated in almost 10 years? It might take twice as long, and I found myself hoping for that to be true. The Northern Territories had come into being in the chaos leading up to the collapse. Hundreds of thousands of refugees from the flooded Gulf Coast and the growing interior superdesert began showing up at the border and simply walking or driving across. After all, it was just an imaginary line, most of which was barely monitored by a handful of immigration officers. What could they have done against caravans of thousands who were generally better armed or more determined than they were? By the time some control of the border had been taken back by the Canadians, it was too late. There were more Americans than locals, and the refugees wanted to remain part of their country. So, 3 western provinces seceded, and a new border was drawn at the 60th parallel, this time fortified by electronic monitoring and thousands of soldiers. It was just before this when I had reached the pinnacle of my former career. In the chaos of change, there was a great opportunity, and at that time, I was driven to exploit it. The driver of a rather sporty-looking ancient sedan lay on the horn as he passed us. The Roadmaster is anything but fast. With the weight of the portable smelter, it drives like an overloaded shopping cart with a sticky front wheel. So, Crystal tends to be conservative on the speed. The anger pressed into the horn of the passing car brought me out of my funk. Its driver made a rude gesture at us in the rearview mirror and then sped off, leaving a contrail of black smoke behind. Crystal automatically rolled up the windows. "Bad diesel conversion," she criticized, concentrating on the road ahead. I said nothing for a while, trying to sort out my emotions, as I watched the line of ragged, drought-stressed trees demarking the edge of Rugby, North Dakota Bend in the rising wind through the side window. The trees suddenly ended, revealing parched brown fields behind them, stretching off beyond the horizon. "We didn't discuss this. I thought we agreed to make major decisions together. I don't understand. The 60th? It makes no sense. They've all but closed the border," I finally let out, feeling both angry and terrified. I found that when I hacked into the BIOS Wi-Fi. Crystal handed me her DIY handheld, duct taped together with scavenged parts. I didn't want to say anything in front of Jack. We don't need word spreading. We don't need any more competition. She explained as I thumbed the crude device on and read the title of the post that she had bookmarked. "Canadian authorities to allow limited immigration for 1 day," I read it aloud. "There'll be thousands, Crystal. Why bother? What's the point? If you're worried about the heavy weather front rolling up to the 60th this year, we could make it to Alaska before it settles in for the season. It's not much further, and we wouldn't have to cross the border." "Read further, Chad. And why the sudden angst about heading for the border? You've never had a problem with any place we've gone before. But you made the call without telling me." "Read the rest, Chad, and you'll understand why. They're looking for people with low-cost solutions to a growing garbage problem," she explained without taking her eyes off the endless straight line of the secondary highway, which looked like a mechanical scar dividing the prairie in two. "We have a scalable, cheap process for recovering precious metals from discarded electronics. In exchange for your ideas, they let you in on a 1-year work permit, and if you do well, they'll renew it. We're getting too old to be driving around the country, evading the heat, the storms, the massive migration. what we've both been looking for, right? There'll be tens of thousands trying to get in, Crystal, I repeated, starting to get irritated. And then there are the other places that we could go this season. Where, Chad? Some overcrowded trailer park in Alaska? Besides, we left early this year, at least a week ahead of the main pack. We need to keep going. We can be at the border in 2 or 3 days, just before they open the crossing. It's why I wanted to get you out of rugby before the story hits the news streams. Why are you suddenly being so obstinate? Because we didn't discuss it, I protested, pushing on this point, hoping it would be enough. We're discussing it now. Give me a good reason why we shouldn't at least try. Crystal was right. Even if we weren't accepted, we would have lost nothing, and would still have a head start on getting somewhere tolerable for the summer. I didn't have a reason, at least one I was willing to admit. Knowing I couldn't push Crystal any further without causing her to ask questions I didn't have the answers for, I sighed, settling back into the seat, and watched the menacing clouds of the summer storm front roll on the horizon in the rearview mirror. At least we could keep ahead of that for now. I pretended to fall asleep so that Crystal would drop the topic, but the gentle swaying of the roadmaster and the monotonous parched prairie landscape conspired to lull me into unconsciousness. I woke a few hours later to the chugging of the roadmaster's cooking oil-fueled diesel as it struggled to keep our mobile home going. The sun had moved across the sky to Crystal's side, and the landscape outside had changed from stressed grass to scrubby patches of boreal forest. The dying trees were in the process of being cleared between outcrops of ancient Precambrian rock on the edge of the Great Canadian Shield to plant genetically designed, fast-maturing corn and wheat. There was a lurch as the motor threatened to stall. Crystal grimaced and crossed her fingers. How long? I asked with a yawn as I stretched my protesting 70-year-old muscles. How long did you sleep, or how long has the motor been acting up? Both. About 8 hours. We're almost to the interstate. The engine problem just started a few miles back. We'll need to stop at the next town so I can figure it out. It's either the filters or the fuel pump. I'm guessing Jack back there in Rugby is cutting costs at the Chicken Fritter Inn by hanging onto his cooking oil longer than he's willing to admit, which means it's dirtier than usual. Flin Flon? I glanced at the nearest town the GPS was showing. It was less than 10 miles away. Crystal nodded. An odd name, I mused. Curious, I looked the place up in the Roadmaster's travel database, which we updated whenever we could steal time on a network connection. The town had been named after a character in a dime store novel, one Josias Flintabbery Flontinen, who piloted a submarine in a bottomless lake where he had discovered a passage to a strange underworld. The prospector, who had found the now long ago depleted copper and zinc deposits, had been reading the book and, on a whim, named the place Flin Flon's Mine. According to the Travel DB, the town had virtually died after the mines closed until the secession made it a minor pit stop on the road to Interstate 1 North. The roadmaster lurched again. Will we make it? We better. I don't want to be stuck out here if it's something other than rogue fritter batter in the fuel. We can't afford to miss the window at the border. I crossed my fingers, but Crystal's engineering skills and misplaced luck got us into town. We were finally forced to pull into the parking lot of a recently opened 24/7 convenience store. While Crystal took the filters apart, I walked around the town, which was nestled between a series of small lakes and abandoned mine workings. The layers of history were evident along the main street. Boarded-up buildings and new drive-thrus, which serviced the annual migration north, stood shoulder to shoulder along roads which held the promise of a never-to-be-realized future. The place had a sense of melancholy, as if it had given up, and was in the process of reconciling with the fact that it would never be more than it currently was. It had probably been a blip on the landscape as I flew over in a former life. Back then, I would have been on my way to cut deals with the powerful in the burgeoning enclaves of the recently acquired Hudson Bay coast. Crystal was sitting outside the Roadmaster, impatience written across her face. Where were you? I was finished almost an hour and a half ago." "Guess I lost track of time," I shrugged. "On your next walkabout, take one of the radios. That's why I fixed them. We need to get moving, Chad, if we're going to make the river ferry before it closes, or we'll lose a day. If I didn't know any better, I think you were trying to keep us here." Crystal eyed me suspiciously. "What is it, Chad? What's bothering you? Have you never crossed a border before? I know it makes some people nervous, but we're what we appear to be. Two seniors trying their best to stay alive and contribute where we can." "Yeah, I suppose that's it." My friend only knew the edited personal history I'd constructed, a fiction that I now almost believed. After the collapse, I felt justified reinventing myself. After all, I had ended up like everyone else, penniless and struggling to survive. The omissions hadn't mattered until Crystal wanted to head for the 60th. I wanted to tell her. I really did. Then the fear and anxiety took over. No, I had to convince her to head for Alaska or Hudson Bay, and once we got there, when I found the right moment, I would tell her. "Let's get going." "Sorry, I should have known it wouldn't take you long to fix the problem." "Your turn to drive," she finally smiled. The last ferry was starting to load as I pulled up the ramp in the rapidly fading dusk. Off to the left, in the gloom, I could make out the flood-damaged bridge, propped up by rusting scaffolding. The repairs had been abandoned years ago, and the ferry installed as a cheaper alternative. The awkward craft consisted of a flat-topped barge with a motor house on one side that winched the thing to the opposite bank along a steel cable. I guess the flood had happened after the collapse, otherwise the bridge would have been rebuilt. An attendant waved us forward. The roadmaster lurched as I tried to ease it onto the wooden deck, waking Crystal. "Huh?" Her head rolled to one side. Then she opened her eyes. "We're on the ferry," I assured her. "Great, but you were driving like an old man. I thought we'd miss it." "I am old," I laughed, "but my reflexes are as fast as ever. The roadmaster's the problem. It's a beast on these narrow highways. Hey, I got us here in one piece, right?" Crystal stretched, then studied me thoughtfully. "The border crossing's still bothering you?" "I'm fine about it. Just not sure it's the right move, that's all. We could go east and spend the summer on the Hudson Bay coast. It's closer, and there's lots of e-waste to recycle for gold. The wealthy replace their stuff as soon as the new models are out in India." "You're joking, right?" Crystal sat up, tensing for an argument. "The whole coast is gated, so we couldn't get near anything. The wealthy always create landfills outside of their enclaves. They're too cheap to ship it away, and the spring migration won't be headed that way for sure. We'd have it all to ourselves." "I can tell you're just guessing, Chad. We can't risk it. We need a couple of good seasons. Our best bet is to still cross the border. Why don't you want to go there? I didn't know you were so xenophobic." I quickly changed the subject. "Can you drive to the campground? You know how bad my vision is in low light with my cataracts." Crystal reluctantly agreed, and we changed seats. Just before the interstate, we pulled off for the night at a place tagged on the map as a free campground. It turned out to be little more than a field, abused into something almost flat by years of camper tires. We were woken early by the shrill tritone of the disaster alert system and a computer-generated voice on the radio tuned to the emergency frequency. "Warning. Overnight, an Arctic front rolled into the area and is colliding with a system rapidly moving from the Gulf of Mexico, creating conditions ideal for the formation of tornadoes. Witnesses have reported 3 funnel clouds in the vicinity of the intersection of Interstate 1 North and Territorial Highway 42. If you are in this area, take cover immediately. Warning." The message repeated. We could feel the roadmaster sway in the rising wind, and rain begin to pound down on the sheet aluminum. I automatically checked the map as Crystal jumped into the driver's seat and coaxed the old diesel to life. "There's an underpass 2 miles up the road," I yelled over the rising wind. We bounced out of the field, and as Crystal turned onto the already rain-slick highway, I glanced in the side mirror. "There's a funnel, maybe a mile away, and it looks like it's headed this way," I told her, feeling calmer than I should have. But it wasn't the first time we had been caught in heavy weather. Crystal put her foot down hard on the gas. At first, the roadmaster objected, misfiring a few times before settling into an angry roar and slowly beginning to accelerate. We had only made it a few hundred yards before Crystal slammed on the brakes. "What are you doing?" I couldn't fathom why she was stopping with the tornado closing in on us. "Someone's broken down." She steered onto the shoulder and waited. "We need to give them a ride." Suddenly, there was a banging on the camper's door. "Let them in!" I unbuckled and leaped out of the cab into the camper section, stumbling down the short stairs to the side door. As soon as I unlocked it, the wind slammed it against the side, and it began to flap so hard that I thought it was going to be ripped off. Then a man burst in, out of the roaring wind and diamond-edged rain. Together we reached out and pulled the thing closed. Go! Go! It is almost here!" The man dripping onto the lino screamed. The stranger and I were pushed against the side of the stairwell as the roadmaster seemed to find some hidden reserve of power and lurched forward, swaying dangerously like a rudderless sailboat in a storm. Crystal struggled to keep control, weaving across the lanes until we reached the underpass. The drumming of the rain suddenly stopped like a fire hose had been abruptly turned off, and the roadmaster skidded to a stop. The cabin lights came on, and my heart skipped several beats. Lying beside me like a drowned man cast ashore by an angry ocean was the past I had been desperate to bury. Before I could object, Crystal had exited the driver's side door and was running up the embankment of the underpass to a small crawl space where the support beams and concrete slope met the road deck above. "Let's go!" I yelled. We burst through the side door and sprinted up the wet cement and wedged ourselves into the narrow space near Crystal so the wind wouldn't suck us out. My ears protested as the noise exponentially grew until it was louder than lying under a freight train or a jet at takeoff. My exposed back was briefly battered by flying debris, funneled through the underpass by the wind. We had been lucky. The funnel had missed us by a few dozen yards. We waited for the wind to die down. Then all three of us slid out on the slick concrete embankment. I was relieved to find the roadmaster was still there, and had fared quite well considering. There were only a few dents on the back and sides. It was the closest Crystal and I had ever been to a tornado in all our years together. Soaked to the bone, we lay shivering in the now cold air, letting the close call sink in. Slowly, the three of us got up, testing limbs, checking for cuts, and looking around. That wasn't the smartest thing to do," our uninvited companion pointed out, gasping for air. "And what would you have suggested we do, Miguel?" Still recovering from our near miss, his name had rolled off my tongue as if I used it every day, which at one point in the past I had. "Chad?" He stood there in the gloom of the underpass, dressed in water-soaked and mud-stained cargo pants, 2 sizes too big, and a Goodwill hunting vest, which hung from his thin shoulders like a deflated life jacket. His dark hair, streaked with gray, pulled back into a ponytail, had lost its battle with his forehead, and now formed a ring around a prominent bald spot. He was the antipode of the person I remembered. The last time I had seen Miguel was in the boardroom of the 50th floor of a new office tower in Yellowknife. He was buff and dressed in a $40,000 custom-made suit, watching the sunset over the waters of the Great Slave Lake through the ochre haze of car exhaust. His back was to the flat screens which lined the opposite wall, where in disbelief I was watching the markets fall and trillions of dollars evaporate, exposing the value of money for the mass delusion that it was. "Chad, is that you? What are you doing here so close to the border, man?" Crystal, already halfway down the slippery embankment to the roadmaster, turned in surprise. "You know this guy, Chad?" "Hi, I am Miguel." "Who?" Crystal shrugged and started to walk back up the slope. You haven't told your wife about me, Chad? The disheveled figment from my past sneered, instantly burrowing a massive hole in the carefully constructed persona I had taken years to create. Crystal is my business partner and best friend. Ah, Miguel laughed. Crystal, you and I have a lot in common then. 30 years ago, that is how Chad would have described me. Well, my old friend, you've dropped a long way to this. He gestured at Crystal and the battered camper. Crystal scowled. Who is this guy, Chad? I stood for a moment, my mind whirling. I felt like a housefly that had blindly flown into a spider's web. Chad? Crystal prompted again, this time with an edge to her voice I didn't like. Crystal, this man is Miguel, a former business partner. That's it, Chad? Miguel scoffed, pulling an old baseball cap out of a pocket and shoving it down on his head to cover his bald spot. After all we had accomplished together, I'm just a former business partner? An old pair of embarrassingly smelly shoes you'd rather forget? You never mentioned you had a business partner, especially a lowlife like this, Crystal spat. In just a few words, Miguel had gotten under her skin. It was a talent, which had been useful back in the day. Hey, look in the mirror, Grandma. Chad and me, we were something once. More than you could say, I'm sure. If old pal there would have been more on top of things, he would have seen it coming, and we would have sold before the collapse. Bought gold and been sipping mojitos in an exclusive summer resort in an enclave on the Hudson's Bay coast. Instead, we're standing here like wet sewer rats in an underpass to nowhere. Let's get out of here, Chad. You can explain later while we drive to the border. I'm beginning to regret picking this guy up. Wow, really? My old friend, you haven't told her, have you? Miguel laughed. My ex-business partner and former friend here cannot cross the border. He's still a wanted person up there. I'm surprised he's even this close to it. What? Crystal, who had already started back to the camper, stopped and turned to glare at me. I wanted to explain. I really did. I wanted to tell Crystal everything I had hidden, but somehow the words were frozen in my mouth. Always the coward, right, Chad? You ran, and you left me holding the bag. It cost me 15 years. Crystal, is that your name? Let me tell you how your best friend is. He was one of the principal architects of the collapse. He came up with the idea to use deep neural networks, deep learning if you want, to design new investment products. There were no humans involved, just two AIs. One was a synthesis engine, which developed financial schemes. The other, a detection engine, which tried to poke holes in them. And if it couldn't, plotted how to implement the ideas. Old Chad here set them up so that they could challenge each other and ultimately design the perfect investment. Then we would market it. But it was too fast, all automated, you see. Who would have known the machines had created the world's most complex Ponzi scheme? Chad had the idea to go after big institutional investors. Mostly pension funds, that kind of thing. It worked until some of the pension managers got cold feet and wanted to move their money. It was a big one. Here in the States, that started the dominoes fall. Southern States Retirement or something like that. It doesn't matter. And we might have survived too, if it hadn't been for the National Public Pension Fund up there on the other side of the border getting wind of some of the rumors floating around. Our operation was headquartered in Yellowknife. It was the rising business center back then. The place to be if you're a player in the new digital economy. Then it all came down. Crashed the National Pension Fund and most of the world financial system. Chad disappeared before the inquiry. Crystal had turned white, her body stiff with shock and rage. I know we tanked your pension fund, Crystal. I was trying to apologize, but it came out wrong. I know you and billions of people lost everything because of us. And that's not why I helped you 20 years ago at that truck stop. We clicked, and we needed each other. It was about our strengths, nothing else. Really, Chad? All these years, it's all been about your guilt? You were just appeasing your conscience by easing the pain of a helpless victim? No, that's not it. But no words formed. It was at a loss to explain. Red-faced with anger, Crystal turned and ran to the camper, slammed the driver's door shut, locked it, and started the reluctant diesel, then drove off, leaving the smell of cooking oil hanging in the air. I convinced Miguel to wait, but by the time the sun began to set, we had to start walking back to where his car had broken down, not knowing if anything would be left to salvage. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB Financial. To listen to other great APN podcasts, such as Putting It Together, please head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com. This episode is brought to you in part by the Alberta Blue Cross Wellness Summit, a day to explore fresh perspectives and practices around wellness at work. Hear what Linda Crawford of Alberta Blue Cross has to say about the summit.
You know, Alberta Blue Cross really wants to support people. We truly, truly are moving the needle in a way that we want to make an impact. And so, coming to even a first ever event is always fun. You can always now be able to say, hey, I was at that event. And our intention is to really leverage and scale this on an annual basis. So why not come and be that first pioneer and leader that raises their hand and says, you know what, this sounds fantastic. I want to be part of this movement, the energy that's going to happen there. Sign me up.
It's happening October 10th at the Renaissance Edmonton Airport Hotel. Sign yourself up at thewellnesssummit.ca. Makeshift Stories is released twice a month, usually around the 1st and the 15th. Today's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Rylan Nilsson. Opening and closing music was composed and recorded by David Hume. You can find more about David Hume at davidhume.me. We want your feedback, so please send us an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. You can help us by telling your friends about us and getting them to head over to Apple Podcasts or their favorite podcast provider to subscribe. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivative license, which means that you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.